Hello.
Hello, welcome to the National's analysis of First Minister's questions today. I'm Richard Mason, I'm a journalist with the National. Joining me is Hamish Morrison.
Hiya, I'm Hamish Morrison, I'm a political reporter with the National.
So we're both watching eagerly First Minister's questions, and Douglas Ross chose this to talk about workplace parking charges, which was a recent thing that came up within the Scottish Government. It's a new thing that the Scottish Government is bringing in, but why was Douglas Ross asking the First Minister about it today, Hamish?
So Douglas Ross is accusing the First Minister of being anti-driver. He's saying that the workplace parking levy, which, as I understand it, I think would impact sort of public sector workers most because they're the most likely to have a workplace that provides parking places, which are going to be charged for under new plan by the Scottish Government. It's based largely on a scheme in Nottingham, down south, which has had it since 2012, which is admittedly a Labour-controlled council in England, but that's pretty much what the scheme is based on. Douglas Ross has taken this sort of line of attack because it's pretty populist. I think a lot of people are, I don't know if a lot of people are against it, but I think a lot of people are concerned about the sort of cost of it. And he chose to drive this line saying, we're facing a cost of living crisis, people's bills are going up. Why are you adding on something else to this? Nicola Sturgeon had a pretty good response to say that this is, the cost of living crisis, frankly, has been created in Westminster, talking about adding on another charge, which is designed to sort of combat climate change and congestion in cities, is a measure that they're pursuing to hit net zero. I think part of it is the sort of opportunism on Douglas Ross's part to kind of rail against a kind of Scottish Government policy that probably is likely to be fairly unpopular. He also mentioned sort of the impact on rural communities. Now, First Minister quite rightly pointed out that this is being left to the discretion of individual councils whether or not they intend to introduce it. So for instance, I would hazard a guess that somewhere like Glasgow City Council, somewhere like Edinburgh would be far more likely to introduce it than somewhere like Murray or somewhere like Aberdeenshire, for instance, or the Highlands.
So yeah, the policy is part of the government's overall net zero plans to get the country to net zero carbon emissions by 2045. And as you say, it's on the local authorities to introduce what sort of parking charges they actually want within their local authority. It's interesting that Douglas Ross has in the past called for decentralisation of government, giving more powers to councils, and now councils are getting more powers. He's criticising the Scottish Government for it.
Yeah, and if he was that against it, then he could sort of try and legislate against it in Westminster, to amend the regulations that allow councils in England to do it. But I don't know if he's made any moves to do that.
Douglas Ross is in a difficult position at the moment, is he?
He's in an invidious position, maybe, not one that maybe anyone would want to take on. But yeah, I mean, it also sort of feeds into, we were talking about climate change, we're talking about net zero. Rachel Hamilton, the Tory MSP, brought up the challenges, the kind of climate change effects on Scotland's peatlands and moorlands, and made, the claim 50% of Scottish species vanished since, I think it was 1994, she said, and asked the Scottish Government when they're going to start taking climate change seriously. We can watch the video now, I think.
I think we can. I think we've got that.
Rachel Hamilton.
I thank the First Minister for this answer, but we know that her government's desktop approach to rural areas is failing. Peatland targets for the past 4 years missed. Emission targets for 5 key sectors missed. Since 1994, 50% of Scotland's iconic species vanished. Lord Debon says the credibility of the Scottish climate framework is in jeopardy. First Minister, when will your SNP Green coalition take climate change seriously and produce a robust moorland strategy to save Scotland's iconic species and protect biodiversity,
sorry, Miss Hamilton,
rural jobs
Miss
and
Hamilton,
livelihoods?
Miss Hamilton, sorry, I could not hear your question. I'm not convinced the First Minister would have been able to hear your question. Would you be good enough to repeat the end of your question, at least? Thank you.
First Minister, when will SNP Green Coalition take climate change seriously and produce a robust moorland strategy to save Scotland's iconic species and protect biodiversity, rural jobs and livelihoods?
First Minister.
It actually beggars belief that a Tory MSP is getting up talking about taking climate change seriously. Clearly they didn't listen to the questioning of their leader at an earlier stage. The approach of the Conservatives, of course, is to say we should take climate change seriously, but then opportunistically oppose every measure we take to tackle climate change when it suits them to do so. And we saw that very, very clearly earlier on today. This government's record on peatland restoration is a good one. I've already spoken about the restoration of 30,000 hectares, the record funding package and all that is enabling. So we'll continue to get on with taking the actions to tackle climate change, and perhaps it's the Conservatives who need to learn to take it a bit more seriously.
So, in a way, Rachel Hamilton is, I suppose, changing the Scottish Conservative position on net zero targets. We're not really sure what that might be.
Yeah,
but
it is sort of kind of green when it suits them approach, isn't it? To say, you know, well, where is your peatland and moorland strategy, while also calling for everyone that drives to work every single day to continue doing that, which I think we'd all accept is not a sustainable policy. Yeah, I think she's got, you know, I think she probably does have a point. As moorlands and peatlands is not something that I'm hugely familiar with. I think there's probably something she's got a point with. She probably knows a lot more about rural issues than I do. But again, I think it does fall into this category of kind of this opportunistic attack, this kind of saying, on one hand, you know, we need to tackle climate change because what's happening to this 50% of species that have vanished since, I said earlier on 1994, I think it was 1954, she said, yeah, we're not facing a mass, you know, sudden extinction since the 90s. But yeah, you know, on one level, taking this populist route, and then on another level, pursuing something that sort of her constituents probably are fairly concerned about. I think that kind of highlights probably what a lot of politicians are facing, a challenge a lot of politicians are facing currently, which is that a lot of climate change policies aren't going to be popular. And as long as you keep pursuing, you know, a kind of populist line on them, I don't think that you're really going to make any movement in a positive direction.
It's difficult because these things aren't going to happen overnight. Like, you're not going to see peatland completely restored overnight to all of Scotland that needs it. I remember but back before the pandemic, actually, the Highland Council wanted to make large areas of the Highlands carbon sink, so it would be able to, restoring a lot of this peatland, so it would be able to absorb a lot of carbon and offset carbon emissions that are continuing to be produced. But it's an interesting position for the Conservative Party to take while they support more development of oil and gas fields in the North Sea. They're also saying we need to restore peatland to meet these net zero targets that the Scottish Government has set itself. It's yeah, it is, as you say, it's opportunistic. It's being green when you need to. It's being taking a populist approach to all these sort of things.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to hear Rachel Hamilton's thoughts on the 6 oil and gas fields that we could be seeing in the North Sea fairly soon.
But of course, that's a reserved policy to Westminster. So
yeah, so we wouldn't dare ask Holyrood about reserved issues, would we, Richard?
Well, why would we? There's a cost of living crisis going on, and yes, and so we'll move on to Anas Sarwar's questions, and he was actually talking about an issue that he raised last week at First Minister's Questions, a windfall tax on big energy firms, which the First Minister has said that she supports the idea of a windfall tax on big energy firms. And could you take us through that, just briefly about what this?
Yeah, so we spoke about this a bit last week when we did this roundup, and it really is Groundhog Day stuff. I think the Labour did pursue this almost exact same line of questioning. Last week, why did the SNP MPs not support Labour's motion for a windfall tax in the House of Commons last week? This motion wouldn't have passed. Labour do not have enough MPs to pass it in the Commons. They certainly don't have enough. Well, it's certainly not, within the powers of Holyrood to legislate on it. I think they think it's a good line of questioning because it sort of plays up to what they want to portray the SNP as this the tartan Tories, the secretly actually in the pocket of big oil and big money. I think the SNP MPs raised objections to it in the Commons. Certainly, Stephen Flynn said that it could put thousands of his constituents out of a job. He's an MP for Aberdeen South. So it does play into that to an extent, but I don't think that people are particularly convinced because it does ultimately leave the ball in one of the SNP's favourite areas. One of an area they're pretty comfortable in saying this is a reserved matter. We do not have the power to legislate on this. Which is fair enough. You can't argue with that.
Yeah, and as we know, energy is a reserved matter. Sorry, so it's
far from resolved.
Far from resolved. So there is nothing the SNP in the Scottish Government can do about energy policy. And certainly in terms of a windfall tax, that would fall to the UK government to implement that. And the windfall tax would be to offset some of the effects of the cost of living crisis as well. So it'd be an interesting position for the UK government to take to introduce a windfall tax to address a crisis that is largely being created by policies of their own generation as well.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, you had Nicola Sturgeon outlining the sort of support and the measures that the Scottish Government are taking to mitigate it, and she brought up the fact that this kind of ongoing confusion about the Barnett consequences that are coming from Rishi Sunak's announcements last week about extra funding, a loan actually for people to pay their energy bills and a council tax grant.
So yeah, let's kind of mention that briefly. So it's a £200 loan that's going to that's apparently going to all people that pay for their energy, that will then be paid off in 5 yearly instalments of £40. So it's not this £200 payment to offset the energy price cap rise. It's this £200 loan.
Martin Lewis, actually, the money-saving expert, made an interesting point last week where he brought up the fact that if you, for instance, are still, a teenager or something living with your parents, by the time that if you've moved out by the time and you didn't benefit from that loan, you will be paying back the £40 a year extra on your energy bills, which I thought was an interesting point because it really is being paid back by everyone, regardless of whether or not you got the £200 loan because you were too young or not paying bills.
It has been characterised by some as being a payment to energy companies that then individual citizens have to then pay back.
We're paying back.
So the energy companies get paid twice, which is interesting. But Nicola Sturgeon actually raised, interestingly, the fact that Scottish Child payment is being doubled in the Scottish budget. And when Anis Sarwar said that the SNP had the ability to vote for the windfall tax in Westminster with their, I think it's 45 MPs, which wouldn't have helped Labour get the motion through because of the Tory majority in Westminster. Nicola Sturgeon raised that the Labour would have the ability to vote for the doubling of the Scottish Child payment to help in some way offset the cost of living crisis as well, which she highlighted that they didn't vote for that at the first stage of the Scottish budget, so they then have the ability to do that as well. So it's interesting kind of tit for tat that played out in First Minister's questions as well.
Yeah, I would be very surprised if they voted for the administration budget, but
yeah, it's just an interesting point. But yeah, there was a lot more covered at First Minister's Questions today. We've got a few more things on the national website already that you can take a look at, and there'll be more throughout the day as well, and into the night, and tomorrow, and in perpetuity as well. So thank you very much for joining us today, Hamish.
thanks very much, Richard.
Cheers, and signing off from the analysis from First Minister's Questions. We'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.